Welcome to the Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen across the nation. Today we shall discuss an extremely interesting memoir of a writer's life, including events that made him a writer. The book is Full Swing: Hits, Runs, and Errors in a Writer's Life. The writer is Ira Berkow, long a sports columnist and a general writer for the New York Times. He is with me today to discuss his latest book. And I am Lawrence R. Valvell, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Ira, thank you for coming up from New York to be with us.
My pleasure.
Now, I should tell the audience, number one, that if we seem to be discussing inside matters, so to speak, at times, it is because Ira and we knew each other back in 1952, 53, 54. Not well, but at least by sight, and to say hello to when we played ball together. And over the course of the years, as I've followed Ira's career, which I started doing around 1983 or 1984, I read a lot of his books. He's written many very fine books. Full Swing, which is the book I'll hold up now, is his latest. A really wonderful one about Red Smith is called Red, a biography of Red Smith. Ira's, I think you would call this your penultimate book, the next to last one.
Right.
It's a book called To the Hoop, and with a great picture on the back. That's just a wonderful picture. And another one is called The Minority Quarterback. This was taken from a New York Times series for which Ira shared in a Pulitzer Prize. So Ira, thank you for being here, and I've enjoyed all your books, including some that I haven't held up. And let me start by asking you a question about something which the mere fact you've written so many books might make fairly evident. You say that somebody to be good at something has to have a real passion for it. You cite even Ted Williams, even Willie Sutton. You cite writers. Talk about that a little bit, about the necessity for passion and how you developed the passion for writing.
Well, when I was in grammar school, I guess there was something innate. I mean, I even wrote some stupid poems for the school paper when I was in grammar school. And but then I stopped. I didn't do any of that when I was in high school because I was mostly interested in playing baseball and basketball on the school teams, and I worked, and I had very little interest in writing. But my life changed in the second part, the last semester of my senior year in high school, Sullivan High School in Chicago on the north side. And I sprained my ankle, and I was unable to play on the high school team in the last part of the season. And I was home on crutches, and I'm not sure what I was doing. I'd read the paper, read the sports section, and I wasn't reading very many books at all. And my father thought that I should. And he also said that you should develop a vocabulary because words are power. And I was a high school senior, and this was just water off my back. And my dad gave me a book, 30 Days to a More Powerful Vocabulary. And like most teenagers, I took my dad's book and I tossed it aside when his back was turned. And I was home for a couple days, hobbling around, getting bored. I saw the book again, I picked it up, and I started reading it. And it was a daily chapter on words, 30 days. And I just fell in love with the words and the language and the etymologies. And they had little tests that you give yourself. There was words like loquacious and etymology, and words that I was unfamiliar with. And I've described this as my sense of it was that it was like Alice falling into a hole into Wonderland, because it opened up a whole new world of language for me. And I had read up until that point a total of 3 books in 4 years in high school.
Right.
And my whole idea in high school was to stay eligible for the school
Right,
team. So I mean,
right.
I majored in eligibility, barely.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I finished lower quarter of my high school graduating class. But then eventually when I went to college, and I eventually graduated from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio,
Yeah.
after flunking out my first semester at the University of Illinois, because I was in accounting and I hated accounting. And then I majored in English.
Yeah.
And it just changed my life. And my dad changed my life, and I've always given him credit for that.
Yeah,
And and so I developed a passion for not only the words, but for reading. And I just started reading everything. And essentially, the rest of my life from the time I was 17 or 18 was trying to catch up on those 4 years that I didn't read, that I virtually read nothing.
Yeah.
And so I've been a voracious reader ever since. And I read in two ways. I read for interest, of course, and I read to learn about some things.
Yeah.
But I also read as instruction in the way writers write.
Yeah.
And I still, after all these years, still underline passages that are particularly meaningful or beautiful, or someone described something and I'm saying, you know, I have to remember this.
Yeah.
And I still, when I run across a word that I don't know and that is not infrequent, I underline it and I write it down on the back of the book, and as I did when I was 18, 19, 20 years old. And then I write the page number, and I go to a dictionary at some point, and I look up the word, and then I have the word alongside the definition, and then I go back to where it was in the context. And so like this, I continue to build a vocabulary, and I continue to learn. I'm 66 years old now,
Right.
and I still feel I'm in some ways a dewy-eyed,
Right.
kid,
Right.
still learning to write and still
Right.
learning about the language,
Right.
and still immersed in it and still loving it.
Right. Well, that, as you know, that all resonated with me dramatically because you came from the same neighborhood, the same backgrounds. Like you, I didn't read. Like you, I spent the rest of my life making up for it. Like you, I underline passages, I look up words. Explain. I mean, this is hard for people in the realms in which I've moved in my life. It is hard for people to understand just how rotten our academic background was. Why don't you talk about high school and a little bit, including the story about the poems and the other. You might as well have gone out and played ball all day as been in class. It was ridiculous.
Right. And well, some of the teachers did try to teach us.
But in my case, they failed.
Yeah, they failed with me as well, and they didn't make it particularly interesting. But one of the more unusual classes was when I was a junior in high school, and she's now deceased, so I can mention her name. Her name was Miss Moody, and a little red-haired thing, and dyed red hair, I'm sure, because she must have been 147 years old. And
if she was a day.
Yeah, if she was a day. But every Friday, some of us had to learn a poem, memorize a poem.
Yeah.
And the poem had to be no less than 12 lines. And so in this school, this public school in Chicago, there were ways to get around learning a poem. Now, there were some kids who did learn a poem, but they were very few. And they were maligned by most of us.
Right.
But so we would get up to write a poem, and some of us would have written poems on the palm of our hand and then up our wrist, and we would read it that way, and she'd be sitting at her desk and she wouldn't notice. Sometimes also we had a book of poetry, and some of us would rip out the page and then tape the poem that we were going to read to the back of the guy sitting in front of us. And so we'd stand up, and some of us would recite some of the songs. I mean, there was one guy who got up and he started reciting, there are 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older, and deeper in debt. This is the song 16 times. It was a popular song by Tennessee Ernie Ford.
Yeah.
Well, Miss Moody was totally unaware of this popular song, and so he got off okay. And one day, it was October of 1955, and I was a baseball fan, and the Dodgers had won the World Series. They beat the Yankees after losing like 7 straight times the Yankees in a World Series, the first World Series that the Dodgers ever won. And for some reason, I don't know what made me do it, but I wrote a poem about this World Series. And not only did I write a poem about it, and not only did I read it in class, but it was 14 lines when 12 was the maximum. So this was 14 lines was like a Herculean effort. And so I recited the poem, and then before sitting down, Miss Moody said, who wrote the poem? Because I'd given the name of the poem, Dodgers Win or something. And I said, I wrote the poem, Miss Moody. And she knew I was a troublemaker, and she said, Ira, if you don't tell me who wrote this poem, I'm taking you down to the office, to the principal. I said, okay, Miss Moody, Charles Dickens. She says, okay, Ira, sit down.
And this was about the level of the instruction.
Yeah, of course, Charles Dickens had been dead for about 100 years.
Yes, right, and never heard about the Dodgers.
Right, never heard about the Dodgers.
He was dead before they were even the trolley Dodgers.
Right.
You know, Ira, one of the unusual things about this particular neighborhood in Chicago is that from a background which you have the story you tell is a very apt indication of the entire non-academic milieu. From this background came yourself, a guy named Gerald Graff, who is known to every college-level English professor in the country, a guy named Joe Epstein, who in those days he was called Mike Epstein, who is regarded as perhaps the leading essayist in the country.
Right.
And 10 years later, and I don't think things changed all that much in the 10 years, Scott Turow. So how does one, and all these people lived within a few blocks of each other, except for Graff, who maybe lived about 3 miles away but went to the same school I did. What accounts do you think account for this?
Well, a lot of them became lawyers and doctors, and none of us had parents who had a much of an education, really. And they're working class people, immigrant families. And I was born in America, and so were these people. But it was interesting that one of them, who lived in a neighborhood similar to ours, who grew up quite a few years before us, but had some similar experiences, who grew up in the Humboldt Park area, was Saul Bellow. And the reason I mentioned Saul Bellow, because he said something that resonated with me. And he had once written that growing up on the streets of Chicago, and when you wanted to become a writer, that writing English in the way that was expected was like writing a foreign language.
Right.
I mean, we didn't know quite how to write in the accepted way.
Right.
But we soon learned, and then we learned to break some of those rules, and as he did, Bellow did. We started getting an education, and we started seeing that we just didn't have to be people working on carts in the old world bazaars and marketplaces.
Maxwell Street.
And like Maxwell Street.
We're going to put and you worked there, and we're going to put a picture of Maxwell Street.
Yeah.
If people, you can't believe what Maxwell Street was like unless you saw it in its heyday. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so we went to school. I didn't have to quit school to work. My parents were working, and they helped me some, go to college. And I worked my way through college as well. They gave me something. But I also remember, and my father was a great man, and he was supportive. But when I graduated undergraduate school, my dad went to 1 semester of high school, broke his glasses, and he was an orphan during the Depression, and that was the end of his formal education. And I went to college, and I graduated with a bachelor's degree. He was very proud of me. And then I said, Dad, I think I might be interested in graduate school. Graduate school? I mean, there's more schooling, He said, I'm not paying for that, but I did go to graduate school in journalism.
Yeah, you got a scholarship to Medill, as I remember.
I got a scholarship to Medill.
Yeah, which is
Northwestern.
For the sake of the audience, that's one of the 3 finest journalism schools in the country, Medill, Missouri, and the Columbia School of Journalism.
Yeah.
You know, and it's amazing, Ari, because you tell a most interesting story about watching your cousin who came from the same background. He went to the University of Illinois, got there before you were in college, and you were with him in the University of Illinois. You thought you were going to spend the weekend drinking, and instead he's underlining every word, you know, and you say, whoa, what is this?
Yeah, I thought we were going to go out to a bar and meet girls, and he was a semester ahead of me, and this is his first semester. His father was a postman, and his father said, I want you to go to college, and I will pay for you to go to the University of Illinois at Champaign, but you have to work. And if you don't study, then I'm taking you back, and you can do whatever you want after that. And so my cousin Ian, we were named for the same grandfather, Ian and Ira, and we're 6 months apart. We played baseball and basketball together, and he was as much virtually a non-student as I was in high school, and he decided he was going to work, and he had to work. And it turned out that he got virtually straight A's in his high school, his college career. And in fact, when he went to law school at DePaul, he was the valedictorian of his graduating class. And then when Ian became a lawyer, and I had thought about being a lawyer until I got waylaid and found writing and then just started writing. But I remember once, and I write about this in the book, I was now in New York writing a column for, it was Newspaper Enterprise Association before I went to the New York Times. And it was a Scripps Howard syndicate, and I wrote for about 700 newspapers around the country. So, and whenever I'd come back to Chicago, I'd see Ian, and we go out to lunch, we got to dinner. So now I came and I went to his office to see him to go to lunch, and his secretary, he was a public defender, he's head of the public defender's office at this time, and his secretary said he was appealing a case in the courtroom. And I go in, and there he is. I see he was about 6'3", redhead, and I see his back, and of course I recognize him immediately. And he's making an appeal to the 3 appellate court judges, and he was defending 2 black men who it turned out had been wrongly convicted of murdering some nuns, and he had found some evidence that had been suppressed, and now he was attempting to save their lives. And I'm sitting in the courtroom, I'm thinking, here I am, going out to Wrigley Field, do a story on a baseball player, and Ian is here saving someone's life. And maybe it was a few times I had some introspection, and I thought to myself, what am I doing with my life when Ian is doing this? And but then I thought to myself that later, as time went on, that I felt that I could do something important as well, and at minimum, as Samuel Johnson would said, bringing the gaiety to nations, and maybe having some humor, but also giving some perspective, because people are so interested in sports, and there's so much of sports that relates to the rest of society. And if you can bring some truth to what's happening in the sports world, it can relate to the rest of the world. And also, it's a form of entertainment. That's not so bad either. And so I've justified now my position. And I eventually became a magistrate, a federal court judge, and I think that we've both been happy in our chosen professions.
It's interesting, Ira, that you thought about, as a lot of people have in this life, what am I contributing to the world? You mentioned that Al Kaline, at one point thought, gee, I should have been a doctor,
Am I wasting my time? Kaline, the great right fielder, for the Tigers.
And you ended up figuring out that there was indeed great value in what you were doing. And you were at lunch with the faculty. A lot of times, our audience knows, because I mention it now and again, because such interesting things happen at lunch before the shows. And you were at lunch with the faculty, and they were hanging on every word because you were telling story after story after story. The point here being that you have moved for the last, what is it, Ira, now? It's about 45, 46 years, with people who, from Nixon to Ali to Jordan to Robertson to, Reggie, you name it, Reggie Jackson, you name it. And the stories you tell are of great interest to people. They're a lot of fun. And I think it's been extremely worthwhile, also because, and you should elaborate on this before we go to break, you have always seen yourself not as I understand it, not as a sports writer so much as a man who is a writer and writes about sports and the people and the relationship of the sports and the people to what's going on in society. Much like, by the way, Barbara Tuchman once said, she's not a historian. She said, I am a writer who writes about history. I think that from you, one gets exactly the same vibes. You want to speak to that?
Well, thank you. I mean, I aspire to that, and whether I succeed to it or not is something else again. But I got into this business because I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to write about what was going on in the world around me. And then when I got into journalism, I wanted to be a good reporter as well, and be a good journalist. And I've been categorized in some ways. Well, I mean, I'm a sports writer for the most part, but a good sports writer is a good journalist.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you write about the world around you. Red Smith once said that the Roman Colosseum, that Yankee Stadium is our equivalent of the Roman Colosseum. And what goes on in Yankee Stadium, what goes on in the Roman Colosseum reverberates, or it has reverberated, to the rest of society. We can draw lessons from these kinds of things. And also, what's true, and we should, are the athletes true, and what they're saying and what they're doing? Is there a fact to this, and is there some importance to it? And in some ways, there is. I mean, and in sports, we've dealt with all the major issues that society deals with: race, gender, labor, psychology, all of it.
Even warfare in its own way.
Even warfare. Well, that's football, I guess.
Football,
or boxing, or tennis is boxing without hitting each other. And strategies and so forth, and what apply. Nixon was big on sports and using metaphors of sports. And sometimes you can go overboard with this kind of thing. But there's lots of equivalent, and there's lots of reasons why the two can't be separated and shouldn't be separated. Sports and society.
Sports are people and people are sports. And, quite frankly, from time to time, as you write, you've taken some heat for things you've written about and things you've said, like what you said early on about Muhammad Ali, for example. The point I'm making is, were you not writing about things that mattered in society, you wouldn't have taken that heat. You took the heat from people, particularly down south, who didn't care for what you were saying because it reflected on the society as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I was one of those who was supporting Ali when he was exiled from boxing by these spineless boxing commissions, and because he didn't go forward and accept entry into the army. And he was a conscientious objector, and they took away his right to earn a living, which I felt was wrong. And eventually, the Supreme Court agreed with those who supported him in an 8-0 decision. There was one who was one Supreme Court justice was sick, but it was a unanimous decision. And and when I was writing about this, and for NEA, and it was going out to Southern newspapers, there were a number of newspapers threatened to cancel the subscription to NEA, and I think some did. But it was to the credit of the people at NEA that said, we back you, you can continue writing, and I did. And so this was really an important element of our culture and our society.
Just for the edification, NEA was the Newspaper Enterprise.
Newspaper Enterprise Association, Scripps Howard Syndicate.
Scripps Howard. Okay, we're going to take a break. Stay with us. We'll be right back with the second segment of our show with Ira Berkow. Welcome back. Ira, I would like to have you hold forth on questions, the interrelated questions. One is perhaps to some extent the opposite side of the coin of the other, to some extent, of confidence and modesty. and your views on the need for confidence in order to get ahead in the world, and the kinds of modesty which you think are desirable or not desirable.
Mhm. Let me first talk about confidence.
Sure.
And I remember Charlton Heston being interviewed on the Johnny Carson show many years ago. And Johnny Carson asked Charlton Heston what advice he would give an aspiring actor. Excuse me. And he said, he quoted his acting teacher, a famous woman at Northwestern. He went to Northwestern. It was a famous woman who was a teacher there. And he quoted her by saying, if someone asks you about how to become an actor, the answer is, don't do it. It's too hard. And of course, if you take that advice, you're not for the business. And early on, when I was in college, I wrote Red Smith, the great sports writer, and sent him two of my columns. And he was critical in a gentle way, but he said to me, if you're for this business, and not many really are, you'll have an eternity of sweat and tears ahead. He wrote this to me when I was in college. It turns out he was right. But when I graduated college, Miami of Ohio, and I was trying to get a newspaper job. I didn't want to leave Chicago. And I came back from Oxford, Ohio, and all four newspapers in Chicago all said no. They'd keep me on file, my name on file, but they said no.
Yeah.
And then there was the Northtown News,
Oh, yes,
the
yes.
Northtown News where we lived.
Yeah.
And there was a gossip columnist named Annie Gerber. And she wrote a column about gossip, and the last piece of the column was Annie's catty comment, and some innocuous, silly comment. And there was also an ad in the Northtown News for what they termed a leg man to help Annie get gossip and news. Now, if this wasn't the lowest point of American journalism, I'm not quite sure what is, but I called her applying for this job. And she said to me, what experience do you have? And I said, I worked for my school newspaper. And I graduated, I have a bachelor's degree in English. She said, that's not enough experience for me. And she said, but why do you want to go into journalism? And I said, I don't know, but I like it. And she said, if you ever get into journalism, she never met me, she didn't know anything about me. She said, if you ever get into journalism, you'll rue the day. You'll regret it.
Yeah.
And I didn't use an expletive to her, but I hung up the phone and I said to the phone an expletive that I know more about me than you do.
Yeah.
And so I eventually got a job, okay? And then I went to Northwestern Graduate School, and then when I went to Minneapolis Tribune, in sports, they hired me as a sports writer. And I was doing poorly. They wouldn't let me write at first, and I worked the desk, and I was bridling, and I had to answer phones from callers in, asking sports questions, and I wanted to be a writer. I mean, and I didn't want this, and so I wasn't great answering phones. I wasn't great at some of this other stuff. And after about a month, the sports editor named Sid Hartman called me in his office, and he said, you're a bright young man, but I believe you've picked the wrong profession.
Yeah.
And this was like a month or two into the profession that I wanted to be in as a writer. And I left the office, and there were tears in my eyes. He didn't see the tears, but there were. And again, I used an expletive, and I said, I know more about me than you do. Talking to him, but talking to myself.
Yeah.
And from that point forward, I started working harder, answering the phones and so forth. And they finally gave me an opportunity to write. And it turned out I covered a golf tournament. I didn't know anything about golf, but it won an award for the best news spot news story of the year in the Twin Cities. And but the thing is, I had for some reason, maybe for some stupid reason, but I had confidence in myself. Maybe my parents had given me the confidence, some basis or something. But also, I had written stuff along the way, and in college, and I'd gotten really good feedback.
Yeah.
I wrote a column in college, and the English department, English classes, the professor would talk about my column, and I'd hear about this.
Yeah.
So things built, and I felt that I could do it. And even with Red Smith, and look over a guy's shoulder, and if he liked what he saw, he'd nod and walk away. If he didn't, he'd say, try again. And my advice to you is try again and again. If you're for this business, not really the hour, you'll have an eternity of sweat and tears ahead. He offered a couple of pieces of advice. He said, my first impulse was to paste up these columns and write in marginal criticisms, but they wouldn't have made you happy.
Yeah.
So, how do I take this? The great Red Smith, who was a literary figure in America, which I later learned. He didn't like, he didn't like my stuff as much I would hope. He'd like. I had read him in the Chicago Sun-Times, and then I'd read him in the Cincinnati paper, and he was out of New York, the New York Herald Tribune.
Maybe the finest sports writer we've ever had.
And so should I be depressed or unhappy? They didn't like my stuff as much as I would hope, or should I be flattered that the great Red Smith took the time to even write me? And I decided to be flattered. And I made copies of those two columns. I pasted them up for marginal criticism.
And the pictures are in the book.
And I wrote a note, and I said, I put those two columns in an envelope with a note. Dear Mr. Smith, please make me unhappy. And we developed a correspondence, and he would make marginal criticisms, and it was like an editor, and he eventually became, he was like my mentor. And so I wanted to learn, and I was prepared to take knocks, if the advice was well-meaning and coming from good direction, which I had its instinct for this, of course. But Red Smith criticizing me, how can you go wrong with that? And other professors, and I would listen to this, but I would know where the good advice was coming and where the bad advice was coming. Annie Gerber gave me bad advice. You'll rue the day. Red Smith gave me good advice, and I was able to juggle that.
You had enough. You had an internal compass that gave you enough confidence to be able to take the constructive criticism without flinching from it or running away from the profession and reject what was not good. And not too many people have that balance. This also gets into the question of modesty.
But can I interrupt one second?
Sure.
Maybe some of that even had to do, well, I had an internal desire to improve. And in high school sports, particularly basketball, a coach, we had a good basketball coach, and he would say, not that way, this way. And I knew he was a good coach. And it wasn't, I was just going to run through a wall for him, but I knew where the good advice was coming from. And I listened to him. And so there was and I actually shockingly improved as a basketball player. And so I knew that, and my dad gave me good advice. And sometimes he would give me advice, and I wouldn't listen to it. And I realized this was wrong. I should have listened to it. So you live and you learn, but you can't be, you can't hold up a block, to learn. You can't be that hard-headed. I was, like a lot of teenagers, I was plenty hard-headed, but to my destruction, or to my detriment, rather.
Well, they say that somebody often reflects in his or her later life, in his or her marriage, or whatever, the kind of treatment that he or she received from their parents. And I think that what happened with your father, and you've written about and told me the stories, your father's obviously quite the man. And I think that when you have a father who tells you things that are right and you find they're right, when you have a coach who tells you things that are right, you find they're right, it creates a certain receptivity to teaching, mentoring, and so forth, which is a wonderful thing. A wonderful thing. Now, you also talk about modesty. And that's a subject in which I am particularly interested because I think this has become a horridly celebratory society. And your mother.
I'm glad you tried to say that word, not me.
Well, we used to have a lawyer who used to talk about accreditators or something. People are always throwing in extra syllables.
And making up new words, neologisms.
Making up new words, indeed. But your mother used to say self-praise stinks,
Yeah,
which
she did.
I thought that was wonderful. And your father, when he was, why don't you tell what he did when he didn't want to answer all the questions? And the athletes you've seen and the other people you've seen who have shunned modesty, shirked modesty, call it what you will, or the people who, as I think was true in our generation, to a much greater extent than now, remained modest and yet had that confidence that you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, I always thought that if I start bragging, I'll jinx myself.
Oh yes, oh yes.
You know, and
Yeah.
because there were times when I said, you know, I'm in this position and this thing, you know, and it didn't turn out.
Yeah.
And I had bragged about that, and it became the reverse.
Yeah.
And so I felt like I jinxed myself.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
You know,
absolutely. I understand that.
yeah, and then you set a high bar for yourself. You could do it in your own mind and strive for something, but once you start telling people this, I mean, there's a pressure now, that you didn't have before.
Yeah, yeah. You have known athletes over the course of time who really carried lack of modesty way too far, haven't you?
Yeah. Well, there's some of these athletes. The first athlete that I know guaranteed victory was Joe Namath in the Super Bowl III, the underdog Jets against the Baltimore Colts, and he carried it off.
Yeah.
Since then, almost every year, some athlete is guaranteeing victory,
Yeah.
and invariably, it never happens.
Yeah,
There
yeah,
was one
yeah.
Joe Namath,
Yeah,
and so.
And you talk about Ali in this regard too.
Yeah. Well, Ali was different. I mean, Ali was really a showman.
Yeah.
And he learned, a lot of people don't realize this, but he learned from Gorgeous George, the outrageous wrestler of the 40s and early 50s. And he saw how Gorgeous George attracted crowds and how he carried himself. And Ali started doing this. I guess it was also giving himself confidence and calling himself, I'm the greatest, where he didn't feel he was jinxing himself. Also, it was at a time when African Americans began saying that black is beautiful.
Yeah.
And so giving themselves this kind of confidence. And here was a black man saying, I am the greatest.
Yeah, yeah.
But he also did it with humor.
Oh yes.
And he became, such a likable figure to many people, except to some of his opponents like Floyd Patterson or Joe Frazier, who he poked fun at and who didn't like it.
Yeah.
But he became he may be the most beloved person in America today, and surely one of the most beloved people in the world.
Yeah, yeah. It's most people don't. I think many people don't realize just how widely
But his
known he
sense
is.
of humor,
Tell a
was
story
great.
about the autographs. That's kind of a cute story.
I was in New York and I was going to travel to Chicago to interview Ali, who was about 1971, and he was training for a fight against Jimmy Ellis. And so I was about to leave, and there was a woman I was friendly with, and I told her I was going to see Ali in Chicago. She said, "Oh, could you get an autograph for my boys?" She had two small boys, 9 and 11. And I said, "I can't get an autograph. I'm a professional writer, and you don't ask a subject to get an autograph or give you an autograph." She said, "Oh, please, the boys would love it." I said, "Well, if the opportunity arises, I will, but don't count on it." So I go to Chicago. I spend the day with Ali. And at the interview, I was about to go home, and I said, "Champ, I hate to ask you this, but would you sign an autograph for two small boys?" He said, "Sure." So I give him my pad and pen, and he asked what their names were, and I told him. And for some reason, I said their mother has trouble making them clean their room. And he writes, "To Timmy and Ricky from Muhammad Ali, clean that room or I will seal your doom."
He was a cute
And
guy.
that was Ali.
He was a cute guy.
Yeah, and I asked Joe Frazier sometime after that the same thing, if he'd give an autograph for two small boys, just to see what Joe Frazier's reaction would be. And he was a very different kind of personality, and he was really a straightforward kind of guy.
Yeah.
And he said, if their mother didn't have trouble making them clean their room, they wouldn't be boys. And he
Yeah.
was right, you know.
Yeah.
And there was a different kind of intelligence, you know,
Yeah.
working there.
Yeah. I want to read you something that Red Smith, I mean, after he was your mentor, you, of course, wrote a biography of him. And you quoted him in the biography on a subject that you have talked about in your books, and I've discussed it with you and so forth. And it's on page 290, which I will find in one moment. And here's what you say about Smith. Primary to the success of Red Smith was his integrity. When you read Smith, you knew you were getting an honest and accurate account of the goings-on. Why don't you discuss, if you would, the question of honesty where we grew up and your own, obviously you have developed always had, I would say, an enormous need for honesty. You came from a house where people were very honest.
Yeah.
And the Hank Sauer story, because this bothered you for, let's see, 52 to 89.
37
is
years.
37 years, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so expatiate on this, if you will.
Yeah. My parents were really very down-to-earth, genuine people. I never knew either one of my parents to tell a falsehood. It wasn't so much that they were above it, they were just beyond it, I think.
Yeah.
And I grew up in this household now. And when I was growing up in the streets of Chicago, as you know, we would sneak into the baseball games regularly, Wrigley Field, Comiskey Park, Chicago Stadium. And we'd go early to games. And one time, I was 12 years old, and my friend was 14, and the two of us snuck into Wrigley Field. And the Cubs were taking batting practices before anybody was in the stadium, in the arena, in the field yet, in the stands. And Hank Sauer, this is 1952, Hank Sauer was the great outfielder for the Cubs then. And he was in left field shagging flies. And he now was going to come in and take batting practice. And he trotted in and took his glove and tossed it on the bench right where we were sitting, right where I was sitting. And then he went up to hit. And in this neighborhood, there was forms of thievery, but minor kind of stuff, I thought. And we all indulged in it. That was just
Pilferage was par for the course.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't really any morality or immorality to this. And we just did it. This is what people did. You know, you grow a little older, you stop doing it. 13, 14 years old.
I look at it now and I consider it shocking, but that's
yeah,
the way
but
it
you
was.
stop. But anyway, 12 years old. So I was 12 years old, and so the glove is there, and oh my God, a major league player's glove. Wow. So I picked it up, and I took it. I pounded the glove, and wow, Hank Sauer's glove. He was called the mayor of Wrigley Field. He was,
Yeah.
And so my friend Jerry said, "Let me see the glove, Ira." So I gave him the glove. He took the glove, he put it under his sweater, and he started running out. He said, "Where are you going? That's Hank Sauer's glove. Let's get out of here." He was 2 years older than me. We started running out, and I said, "Well, I mean, let's at least stay for the game." He said, "Are you kidding?" We ran out. He ran to the elevated train, and he got on the elevated train, and we kept changing trains because he thought maybe somebody was following us.
That's a guilty conscience for you.
Oh my God! Yeah. Well, he was being a smart thief.
Yeah.
And so I thought about this, and I just felt terrible for Hank Sauer about this. And that winter, in Sport magazine, there was a profile on Hank Sauer because he had been named the most valuable player in the league, led the league in home runs and RBIs, and most valuable player in the All-Star game in 1952. Hit a home run in the All-Star game.
And he was playing for a fifth-place team. This
Yeah,
doesn't happen.
fifth-place team. He was the great Hank Sauer. And in this profile on him, it said that he is very careful about what he does with his baseball gloves now because midway in the season, one of his baseball gloves disappeared. He tossed it on the bench, and it disappeared. Well, I read this, and I had such pangs of guilt.
Yeah.
And I think pretty much about this time, I stopped stealing. And and I thought about this for years. And then I became a sports writer. And I thought one day, I know I'm gonna meet Hank Sauer because he became a scout, he was a coach, and he was around, and I'll tell him what had happened. And year after year passed, and nothing happened. I never saw Hank Sauer. And now it's 1989. It's the third game of the World Series, Giants in Oakland. I'm in Candlestick Park, and there's the earthquake in Candlestick Park.
Yeah.
And I had thought about Sauer because he was a coach, he was a scout for the San Francisco Giants. I thought he might be at the game, and I was going to find out where he was, and I was going to try to go see him at some point. Well, now everybody's leaving the ball. It's an earthquake.
Yeah.
And we're leaving the ballpark, and I'm about to go to a ramp, and coming from the other direction, who was going to go down the same ramp, there is that craggy face, the same face. That is Hank Sauer.
Yeah.
And I was with a friend of mine, Tom Callahan, and Hank turned out was with his wife and his son and daughter-in-law. And I said, Tom, there's Hank Sauer. I got to say something to him. And I didn't tell Tom what it was about. I said, I'm going to ask him privately to step aside. Could you talk to his family? This obviously was family. There was people. And so I said, Mr. Sauer? And he said, yeah. And he looked at me as if I want his autograph in the middle of the earthquake. And so I said, I have something important to tell you, but I have to tell you privately. He said, well, okay, what's this all about, you know? So then I said, well, you remember in 1952? He said, well, of course, that was my MVP year. I said, and you had a glove that disappeared? He said, yeah, my glove disappeared. I said, well, let me tell you what happened. And I briefly told him what happened. He said, you stole my glove. I said, I didn't steal your glove. It was my friend, and he put his great big hands on my throat, and he said, you stole my glove. And I said, I did. And then he smiled, and he took his hands, great big strong hands, he took his hands off my neck. And he said, I'm glad you told me, and I'm glad you got it off your chest.
Yeah,
you know, after all these years.
Yeah.
And I did.
Yeah, and that was very perceptive of him. I mean, it might have been obvious to him at the time, but it was nonetheless, I think, perceptive. And really said something about the degree to which, at some point, honesty took over our lives. And, you know, we wouldn't dream of doing anything anymore that was...
Right.
Like in your writing, you wouldn't dream of writing something that was false or insupportable or something like that.
No, you could, and especially it's the New York Times, because they have lots of fact checkers. But I wouldn't anyway. I mean, for my own personal satisfaction, you want to get it right.
Right.
And then things change. Now, although I didn't steal anymore, but in high school, in Chicago public school, there was again this aspect of immorality about cheating on tests. I mean, we all sort of did it.
That's right.
And no one thought otherwise. But when I went to college, I mean, now I'm thinking, I'm in college on my own volition. And in high school, you were there because you had to be there, you know? And now, who am I cheating if I would cheat in college? And so, of course, that was the end of that. I mean, I worked hard and I studied, and eventually I made the dean's list. I even got a scholarship to I got a scholarship to undergraduate school and as well as graduate school.
You know, Ira, I must say that one of the very disappointing things to me about my own profession is how crooked it has become in the last 30, 35 years. I looked at this thing, and I lived through the same kind of stuff you did, because the two high schools were a piece in a pot. And you know, how amazing that the eighth period German class of Miss Siegel-Schmidt always got 100 on the same test that her first period class had, you know. Oh my, how did that happen? And you know, I look on all this stuff with just absolute horror, and on what happened in Wall Street with absolute horror. So I guess maybe in a way we're like the reformed alcoholics, but we're straighter than straight. We have to take a second break. Stay with us. We'll be right back for the final segment with Ira Berkow. Welcome back. Ira, you have a particular trait which I would like you to elaborate. It's one that I think Casey Stengel had. When you'd ask Casey Stengel a question, you'd get 100 stories, but the stories all bore on the answer to the question. And I know that I do the same thing. You learn from events. You learn permanent, lifelong lessons from particular dramatic events. And so I'd like to have you talk about some of the events and what you learned from them, and how what you learned affected you throughout your entire life. Let's start with when you were working on Maxwell Street, which is this incredible bazaar-like street in Chicago that out-Delancy's Delancey Street in New York, you know. and we're putting a picture of it up. And some kid, after working all weekend, lost all weekend's earnings to a three-card Monte shark. Why don't you explain what happened?
Yeah, I mean, I was selling stockings at the time, and I worked for a man on the street. The street was about about 1 mile long, and it was packed on Sundays, and people, and it was really a place. There were the gypsies, there were the blues guys, there was the crooks, everything, and everything was going on at that point. And so one of the guys who, at the end of the day, we pack up our stockings in cardboard boxes, fold up our card tables, and with a wagon take them to the store or the basement area where the goods were brought back, and then we'd give the guy our money. We'd get who was in charge. We get our 15% of what we sold. And this one guy, he was a red-haired guy, and he wasn't much older than me, and I was maybe 16 at the time, and he might have been 18 or 19. And I remember a beefy red-haired guy, and he was a nice guy. And he was coming back with something like $120 in his pocket, and he was going to get 15% of that, selling the stockings during the day, working from 8 o'clock to 6 o'clock. That's what we all did. And a three-card Monte guy stopped him and said, "Why don't you can you see which card is the middle one? You know, the ace."
Yeah.
And he said, "Okay, I'll put $5 on this." And he won, and the guy gave him some money, and then he won again. The guy gave him some money, and then the third time he didn't win. He didn't win again. He didn't win again. He may have won one, didn't win again. And I was watching this. I pulled my wagon, I just stopped, and I'd watch this. And within the space of maybe a half hour, he had lost his $120.
Yeah.
And he had to work 4, 5, 6 Sundays, something like that, to make back that $120 that he owed the guy who owned these stands. And I thought to myself, hey, be careful. You know, I once, Percy Foreman, you may not know, is the great defense attorney from years ago.
Right.
And I interviewed him once, and he was a successful man. I said, "What do you attribute to your success?" And he said, "I was able to learn from other people's mistakes."
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I didn't have that trait necessarily, but I was able to learn a few things, I think. And one of the things was be careful about guys who you aren't sure about. And this was the three-card Monte guy, and I never got involved in a three-card Monte thing or anything like that, because I was always wary of that instance when I was maybe 15 or 16 years old.
Was that the incident, too, that sort of warned you off drugs before drugs ever were around, so that when people would say to you, we all were offered stuff in the 60s and 70s, and I never got near it, and I gather you never got near it, and for the same reason, really.
Well, I think even starting when I was playing ball, I mean, guys would offer you a cigarette or something, and you knew that you shouldn't smoke cigarettes because you'd be shortness of breath. And I did everything I could to be a better player. Yeah. And so I wasn't about to smoke cigarettes, no matter how many girls might offer me cigarettes, or whatever, at parties or whatever it was. I just wasn't going to do it. And so, there was that built-in thing of not having to be pushed to things. And, I wasn't quite this, but you talk about lessons. Gary Sheffield, an outfielder now for the Yankees, who was the nephew of Dwight Gooden.
Yeah.
And maybe 10, 12 years ago, Gooden he's had drug addiction problems. And I remember in a locker room saying to Gary Sheffield, "Why is it that your uncle has gotten into these problems and you haven't?" And he said, "Because my uncle is a follower and I'm not."
Yeah.
And I've always felt from some of these experiences that I wasn't a follower. Yeah. I wasn't necessarily a leader, but I knew where not to go.
Yeah.
And maybe it was also my parents who were instrumental, in guiding me.
Yeah.
They didn't crack a whip necessarily, but I just followed what they did in many instances. And I had the good sense to do that. Where I got this good sense, I don't know.
One thing that happened, I think it was 1957, and it apparently had a permanent impact on you and affected your attitudes towards Tonya Harding, maybe even Pete Rose. I don't know. And that was a story about a fellow named Benny Bedwell who was picked up and convicted in the newspapers, as it were, in Chicago, for killing two sisters.
Yeah.
Why don't you elaborate that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I was 17. I just turned 17. I remember it was January 1957, and there was a ghastly murder, a grisly murder. Two sisters, the Grimes sisters, were murdered, and they were found in a culvert in the forest preserves. It was big headlines, and everyone was looking for the murderers. And finally, the sheriff got a guy named Benny Bedwell, who was a ne'er-do-well in Skid Row, and they got him, and he confessed to the murders. And headlines, Sheriff, I forgot his last name, Lohman, I think it was, we got the murder, he confessed. Wow, this is fantastic. Well, then the coroner, and he said, I took these girls and we had hot dogs and whatever, and then the coroner found that there were no hot dogs in their system, and other things that Benny Bedwell had said were wrong, and he couldn't have been there because witnesses had said he was somewhere else. He had confessed to the murder, and he didn't do it. And so in the newspapers, I mean, maybe it was on page 15, Benny Bedwell's released, and so what a thing, and so from that point forward, I remember thinking.
He had been convicted in the papers.
In the papers, he had been convicted. I mean, because they all believed what the sheriff had said.
Yeah.
This guy did it.
Yeah.
And so it was all over the paper.
Yeah.
And so from that point forward, I realized, number one, you can't believe everything you read in the papers.
Yeah.
And number two, you can't believe even if someone confesses to something. You've got to look further, which has helped me as a journalist to check more stuff.
Yeah, and it caused you, we have about 30 seconds, it caused you to actually take Tonya Harding's side against all the smart money, so to speak, when that thing with Kerrigan came up.
Yeah, she was accused because her ex-husband was behind the trying to break the knee of Tonya Harding's great rival Kerrigan, and she said she was innocent, and the Olympics were coming up in a month. She didn't have time to marshal her defense, and I felt that she's denying it. There isn't all the evidence against her. She should participate in the Olympics. Most of the country was against her, and it turned out that I wrote that she should go to the Olympics, and I was heartened that a federal judge in Washington State who was dealing with the case also agreed that she should go to the Olympics, and she did.
See, you should have been a lawyer.
I should have been a lawyer.
Thank you for coming up.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank you, Larry.
To the audience, the man writes wonderful books. They're really fun to read, and they say a lot. So you ought to read at least his most recent one and some of his previous ones, too. And be with us again for the next issue, the next installment of Books of Our Times, the next time it comes up. Thank you.